Hear me, true and noble knights who remain loyal to our king. Heed my words in God's name, for what I have to say is vital. Since we're about to take up arms in defense of our names, our land, our lives, and the lives of those we love, our wives, our children, and to win the greatest honor, and to restore the peace of Holy Church, which our enemies have shattered and violated, and to earn redemption and forgiveness for all our sins, be sure that none of you lacks courage this day. All right, that stirring speech is from William the Marshal, or William Marshal's call to arms, call to the troops before the Battle of Lincoln. We have been talking about chivalry here on Young Heretics, a much maligned concept. And since this show is the classical education that you never knew you were missing, we set out to sort of ask just what is chivalry? It's something that people seem to really want to know a lot about, but it's also something that there doesn't seem to be a lot of good information about in popular culture. It's been called, a disguise for sexism. It's been called a kind of outdated sort of idealism. And I've been arguing on this show that chivalry is none of those things. It is a tradition of masculine excellence, which exists to shape the raw material of manhood and direct the basic facts about what men are like. As one half of the human population, created in the image of God, men have certain tendencies, things like, aggression and dominance and aspiration to protect and to provide, right? Chivalry is a tool, the best tool, I think, maybe ever invented, for shaping those natural raw materials into something called a man. And the way that we do that shaping is by telling the stories of great knights throughout the past. Because even if we sometimes, as in the history of William Marshal, even if we lionize these people and make them larger than life, that's part of the point, because it invites us to aspire then in our own lives, knowing that we're broken, knowing that we're flawed, knowing that the material we have to work with and the history within which we live is lacking and part of a fallen world. Nevertheless, we shape what we have to work with, and we use the tools that are given to us, including the history of chivalry and the history of great knights gone past. We're studying William Marshal because he was, in many ways, the greatest knight, certainly England's greatest knight. And even though the circumstances under which we live are completely different from his, we can draw the true principles of chivalry, the long-standing principles of nobility, honor, loyalty, generosity, strength, right? We can draw those principles out and we can figure out how to live them out in our lives. When I started doing this series, I did not know quite how urgent it was going to be, because this is the first episode. This episode today is the first episode that I have recorded since we've been watching this actual war unfold in Ukraine. And I'm not going to say too much about the specific details of those events, and here's why. This is not a show that follows current events. These episodes come out a couple weeks after I record them. I don't know what's going to happen, and that's part of what's so scary about our situation, right? I don't know what's going to be going on as you listen to this. Nobody ever knows in reality, right? C.S. Lewis reminded his listeners during World War II that all war does is it makes it impossible to deny the situation that we are always in, which is we don't know what's going to happen. Nothing is guaranteed. There's no such thing as the end of history or whatever, where everything's just going to be fine and dandy from now on and nobody's ever going to have to go to war or anything. We do not know what's going to happen. And that means we truly do not know. That means despair is a sin, and it means that our kind of optimism may be naive. But the one thing we can be sure of is that what we will be called upon to do is exhibit the virtues which are eternal and of old. And near the end of this episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about the modern day and how we can live out the virtues of chivalry. I'm going to take a mailbag question about that from locals. But before I get into any of that, I'm going to take us back to the Battle of Lincoln, to the life of William Marshal, and finish up our conversation about him, because we have to take seriously the life of the past in order to understand what are the eternal values that we can bring into the present. So I'm not going to, tell you what you can expect from the situation in Kiev. I'm not, I don't even know what's going on there right now as you're listening to this, because, I'm recording this in the past from where you're listening. But the point is, right, that principles we are studying here are eternal, and our job is to figure out how to manifest them in the here and now. And the way we do that is by going back to the past and watching the lives of the greats. William Marshal is one of the greats. Chivalry is the principle, the system of life that he embodied, and it is the system for shaping manhood into true masculinity and valorous masculinity. So let's get into it. Let's talk about the situation that William Marshal ended up in at this seemingly hopeless Battle of Lincoln, and then we'll talk a little bit about the system of chivalry that shaped him into the man that was ready for the hour. They say, cometh the hour, cometh the man. Never were truer words spoken than in the case of the Battle of Lincoln, where everything looked terribly bleak, and this one man, now at the age of 70 or a little, potentially even a little older, this 70-year-old man had to ride into battle against the French and their allies in England. Let's get down to it. So I was just hanging out with a friend of mine, and he was talking about how his ex is using his Netflix account. And I was like, there's literally an app for that. It's called Truebill, and they're sponsors of my show. No joke. This is actually a thing that happens, and it's not unique. I mean, there are all sorts of ways that subscription services know how to get their hands in your pocket. They offer you a free trial or, a year's worth of, low price subscription, and you sort of think, what the heck, and you sign up. And then, of course, you forget about it. You're not using the service, but you open your credit card bill, and sure enough, here's a list of money that you're just paying for no reason. Truebill is the solution to this. They go through your accounts and find the ones that you're not using, and then they help you cancel them so that you are not shelling out money for stuff that you're not using. As everybody knows, it is very important to me that we build a vast Young Heretics empire, and therefore we need Truebill. So you go to truebill.com/heretics to start canceling today. It could save you thousands of dollars a year. There's a lot of money out there that you might just be giving away. Matthew B. gives a testimonial that he saved $660 for the year on DirecTV, $120 for the year on Sirius, and $840 on car insurance. That's a lot of money that you could be putting toward building our vast imperial fleet or other project for the Young Heretics empire. Go to truebill.com/heretics and save thousands a year when you start canceling your unwanted subscriptions. So let's just remind ourselves, right, about what's going on here between England and France. William Marshal is a knight who lives through one of the most turbulent and eventful periods in English history. He lives throughout the Angevin dynasty, these kings that are constantly warring with one another and have these sort of shifting allegiances between their own English property and their English realm, and also the French, right? Huge, larger than life characters passing in and out of the stage now. Philip and King Philip Auguste, Philip the Great in France, Richard Lionheart in England, followed then precipitously by King John, one of the worst kings, perhaps the worst king that England ever saw. And William Marshal lived through them all. And we were talking about the centrality of loyalty, the virtue of loyalty to his chivalry, and why that was so important, because he was caught in between all of these different shifting politics. And in order to hold his allegiance above the politics, hold it up to truth, right, he had to have this idea of loyalty that no matter what, right, he was going to honor his word. And everybody came to respect him for this, that, even if he said, I'm going to pay the king's debts, and he didn't have any money, but said he was going to do it, everybody trusted him, right? That principle of loyalty is the principle of looking beyond the momentary desire. Right now, you could really just, if you just tell a little lie, if you just compromise a little bit, you could get vast rewards from the king. But one of the things that the biography shows is that in the long run, this all comes back to bite you. This conflict between the French and the English, which arises in some sense out of the closeness of the two burgeoning countries, right? Because the kings of England since 1066 and the Norman invasion have also been nobles in France, including, a lot of the western part of what is now France. Because of that, they're always in this struggle over territory and over conquest. And there are plenty of jokes in this biography of William Marshal about, how the French loved to turn tail and put up the white flag. And, Richard Lionheart was valiant in the Third Crusade, but, Philip just sort of snuck back and started invading his territories before Lionheart could get back. And all these digs, right, that we now know of old. This is not a new thing. And so I'm going to just lay the groundwork a little bit by reading to you from a treaty, a negotiation that the Pope tries to broker. The Pope kind of enters these ongoing conflicts during the reign of Richard Lionheart, enters on the side of the French. And so it's the Pope and the French versus Richard Lionheart. And here's the passage from the biography that I want to read to you, just to show you the tenor of the situation. And then we'll move forward in time to the Battle of Lincoln. It's down on record that the papal consistory decided to support the King of France and sent a cardinal to settle matters for him without delay. His name was Master Peter, a wily, sly, deceitful man. With his background, he'd become adept at doublespeak. When he arrived in France, he was joyfully received by the king and all his barons. They sensed he was clever and cunning, just what they needed, and made a great fuss of him. Now, note that there has always been, going way, way back to before the Protestant Reformation to, even at this point, we're before Magna Carta, there has always been this sort of tension between English Christianity and the institutional Catholic Church, which is taking its shape at this time, right? England was bound to be a hotbed of the Reformation because of its distance, because of its sort of independent spirit, and because in this war between religious power and state power, right, the English kings are hungry for independence of their own. And that's going to be a feature, a dimension of Magna Carta, is that the church has to come back in and kind of broker this peace between the state powers. And eventually it's going to be a feature of the Reformation. But one of the things we find out in this book is that this goes way, way back to before the Protestant Reformation and all of that. This cardinal, says the author, this cardinal, Master Peter, whose word was never to be trusted, told him he would broker peace or a lengthy truce, and the king accepted this. Realizing he had little choice, there was no other way forward. So he sent able, courteous envoys to King Richard, earnestly requesting that he should come and confer without delay between Le Goulet and Vernon. After delivering their message, they specified the day when the two kings should meet and talk. And so now enter King Richard, right, the Lionheart, the great king, and he's going to be the sort of paragon of virtue and stability and integrity, right, masculinity in the heart of all these sort of backbiting Frenchmen and papists, right? King Richard graciously agreed, and in brief, on the appointed day, he came to Le Goulet with a great company of barons, seeking to make no presumptuous claims, truly only to recover his own land. Remember, this is a conflict over lands that the Angevin kings hold in what is now France, right? That Philip wants for his own. But slippery King Philip, with his customary hauteur, treated the conference with contempt and didn't deign to appear. All high and mighty, he stayed away. King Richard knew exactly what he was up to. There was no mystery to his little game, but patience. Measure and moderation are valuable qualities, and he waited till it was clear that King Philip in his arrogance wouldn't attend the talk. But then the legate came on his behalf, a man with an amazing talent for deviousness and shiftiness, for twisting words when it suited him. Sallower than a kite's foot, he came before King Richard and played the saintly pious hermit, oozing humility. He hailed the king in the name of God and the curia, saying they cherished and respected him as the son of Holy Church, and King Richard greeted him in turn with great courtesy as a learned cleric and cardinal and spiritual father. The cardinal, thinking the time had come to say his piece, and confident that he could twist the king round his little finger, said, "Sire, the King of France has sent me here. He is full of goodwill and would gladly make peace if you'll agree." "How," the king asked, "can we secure lasting peace? I ask this as one deprived of what is rightfully his. When he returns my land and my possessions, I shall serve him well, and I'll forgive him the wrongs and damage he's done me, and the broken oaths and pledges he made, that when he returned to France, he'd leave my land and my people untroubled and untouched, till 40 days after my own return. I'll forgive him all this. I'll not say another word, if he's sincere about wanting peace. But otherwise, good sir, there can be none between us." "Sire," Master Peter replied, "I wouldn't dare promise you that. No one could persuade him to give back all he's taken. His counselors wouldn't approve and never will." "Then God be with you," said the king. "In that case, there'll be no peace between us, long as I'm fit to ride a horse. You can tell him that from me." So this gives you a flavor for the kind of interactions that are going on between the highest powers in the land at this point, the kind of pride and nobility, the sense of honor, right, with which Richard and in truth also King Philip, right, are engaged, and Marshal, William Marshal, is kind of in the midst of all of this. In some sense, he's trapped because he's moving up in the world. He's going to have to pay attention to his lands in France as well as his lands in Ireland and on the British island. And so he's sort of navigating all of this with this scrupulous and punctilious sense of honor. And that's what he comes to be respected for, right? And so as these kings are squabbling, and as these clerics are kind of double dealing and doing backhanded backroom deals, right? William Marshal is developing his own reputation as somebody who's trustworthy. He's becoming an earl, right? He's moving up in the world, and now he eventually finds himself, under fire in the heart of the court of King John. We talked about this last week, that he has this kind of necessary double allegiance that King John first sanctions and then goes back on. But even despite that, he doesn't support the barons and their uprising against King John. As we know, we've told the story over and over again now, King John fails utterly, loses the lands in France, is forced into Magna Carta, which sort of reduces the power of the monarchy relative to the barons and to the nobles, and eventually dies, leaving England in a sorry state indeed. And that is where we resume our story. We have these hostilities with France, which have been brewing. We have a thoroughly incompetent and dishonest leader who sort of fails in the duties of chivalry. And he leaves William Marshal, this knight who has seen it all, right, in charge of the young king, not Henry the Young King, whom we talked about last week, but this is Henry III, actual only king of England, but he's just a little kid. And so everybody agrees, Marshal kind of, protests, but everybody agrees that it's got to be him. He's got to be the one. There's no money left. There's no leadership except for Marshal, right? He is basically now the king of England. and he's risen up from, not poverty, but relative obscurity, to be in charge of the land he loves, right, against a massive foreign power with supporters in England. Because, of course, as loyalty to the English crown has deteriorated, some of the English nobles have gone over to the French side. And the Battle of Lincoln is a battle basically against those rebels, against the future King of France, Louis, and the rebels that support him on the one hand, and this sort of chivalric knight on the other, the man who is ready to defend England against all costs, but also is up against a completely deteriorated state. Incompetent, the wages of incompetent leadership have now come due. There is no money in the coffer. It looks basically hopeless. And everybody knows that Marshal is the man for the job. Why? Because he has shown time and again that his allegiance, his loyalty, right, is to higher things than this or that good or bad king or monarch. And this is perhaps the first lesson that we can draw, right, out of this whole sordid phenomenon, is that being a chivalric presence, that is, being a knight, right, and having a devotion to things above yourself, does not depend on your country going well or being led by people that you particularly admire. Ours is not the first time that the West has looked back at, profligate spending and bad leadership and realized that we have now written ourselves a check, a massive check, which has come due and which we cannot pay, right? This is the situation that, in a smaller context, William and England found themselves in. But of course, for them, it was the whole world, right? And so for us, right, in our temptation to despair, we remember bad things do happen in this world, right? And none of us has control over global geopolitics. None of us is singularly responsible for turning the tide of the world. Indeed, some of us, are having to reckon now with our basic helplessness, right, in the face of these massive political squabbles and movements. The thing about this, friends, is that God places us in the sphere where we are called to exert influence, and that is the only place where we have any control. And guess what? Right now, you are not in control of the clashes of the world, right? You don't run the world. God runs the world. He has foreseen even this moment in history, no matter how bleak things look. And so the question for you, just as it was the question for Marshal, right, is how are you going to enact virtue and chivalry in your personal life, right? Within your family, within your town, within your community, right? Terrible moments can come up in human history, and they can visit tragedy upon us. We live in a fallen world, right? But the lesson of Marshal is that whatever cards you're handed, your duties and your values should be the same, right? That's what loyalty means. It means loyalty to these higher causes that stay true in the best and the worst of times. So in a second, we're going to read one moment when Marshal was tempted to surrender, and when his sort of buddies, his closest advisors and counselors, which is another important thing in medieval knighthood, right, to have pals around you who will tell you the truth, right? His pals buck him up to go out into the Battle of Lincoln, which he would eventually win and turn the tide. So let's read that in just a second. Here at Young Heretics, we often talk about your immortal soul, but we do not want to neglect the sole of your foot. So, Sole is the company that is going to help you revolutionize your footwear game. They make these great footbeds, which I had never heard of before they reached out to me. But then when I tried it out, it was kind of mind blowing because if you're an active person, if you walk or run or bike or really anything, you're probably positioning your foot wrong. And our feet really take a beating. They get, messed up and they kind of cause all sorts of other problems with our posture and stuff. Sole's footbeds are designed to fix that. They're super comfortable. They also make a bunch of other footwear, including flip-flops that I wear around the house all the time. But I also wear their footbeds when I'm lifting weights, like deadlifts and squats, when you're putting a lot of pressure on your feet. You want to make sure that your foot sole position is optimized. So here's what you do to get an exclusive deal just for Young Heretics listeners. You go to yoursole.com/heretics and use the offer code heretics to get 50% off. That's yoursole.com/heretics. You get half off your first time order, which is an incredible deal, especially since these things are already really reasonably priced already. Save your soul and your soul by going to SOLE at yoursole, yoursole.com/heretics and get 50% off. So here's Marshal gathering his closest friends and advisors, including John of Early, who's his squire that commissioned this biography, and basically letting them in on his heart and his despair, right? I need your advice, says Marshal, by the faith I owe you. I've ventured into the wild sea, where even the most experienced sailors find no shore or anchorage. It's a wonder that anyone ever comes to port. May God come to my rescue. I've been entrusted with a ship that's already close to sinking. You can surely sense it. Our child king's treasury's empty, it's disastrous, and I'm a man well on in years. His heart was so afflicted that tears welled from his eyes and ran down his face, and those with him, their love for him sincerely felt, shed tears of pity. Then he looked up and said, "Have you nothing more to say?" "Yes," said John of Early, who'd grasped the situation fully. "You've assumed a task that can't be shirked on any account, but in seeing it through, even with the worst outcome, you'll win great honor. Let me propose the worst and show what honor will befall you. Suppose all your side desert you for Louis and stoop so low as to surrender every castle to the point where you've no refuge left in England and have to abandon the land, and Louis pursues you and you flee all the way to Ireland. Even then, you'll have won great honor. So then, if the worst result is honor, the best is elation and the highest prestige. You'll know joy indeed if God sees to it that the best befalls you. Even the dimmest will have to admit that no man of any lineage won such honor in this world. That's a prize worth winning." "By the holy lance," the Earl replied, "that's good and true advice. It stirs my heart so much indeed that if all the world had abandoned the king but I, do you know what I'd do? I'd carry him astride my neck and bear him unfailingly from isle to isle, from land to land, even if I have to beg for bread." All right, now is the time for us to talk about that virtue of courage. We talked about a lot of other chivalric virtues, prowess in war, loyalty, integrity, all of these things, but we haven't yet really talked about courage. And here's the important thing to start with in that council, in that scene of exchange, is that even though this is a biography that's very pro-William Marshal, right, it is not a biography that tries to hide every possible weakness. And it is not a biography that tries to hide his fear. One of the great things about medieval writers is that they are pretty frank about their emotions, actually, and about the emotions of their characters. And here Marshal says, everything looks lost, right? I've been given charge over a ship that is already sinking. There is a metaphor with which we can perfectly well relate, right? Some of the stuff that we're facing today, the seeds of it were sown 20, 30 years ago, 20, 30 years before our birth even, right? The seeds of inaction on Russian aggression are, go back to the Obama administration and before. The seeds of decadence in the West might well predate us, and we might even feel like we actually are not really responsible for them. And yet this is the ship that we are piloting. And it's natural to feel afraid. You've probably heard that John Wayne quote, right? Courage is not being not afraid. It's being scared to death, but saddling up anyway, right? And that is what John of Early, the closest counselor of the knight, recommends. That's why you should have counselors around you who can recommend this sort of thing to you, right? And buck each other up, as they say in the Bible, iron sharpens iron, right? He says, what John of Early basically says is, okay, imagine the worst actually happens. Like, sure, imagine it. Let's say that everything goes terribly wrong. You're deserted, you're abandoned. You will still have stood up for a doomed cause of the right, and there is honor and glory in that. And if honor and glory is the worst of what you win, then you will have won a great deal. This depends on the Christian outlook that these people have, right? That there is a life beyond this life, and that the salvation that God promises is worth every kind of suffering, right? We have to be at peace with that idea. We have to have made peace with that idea in order to preserve our joy in this fallen world and to preserve our courage in this fallen world, because that enables us to say, not everything's going to be fine, right? Everything's going to be fine is the wrong answer to anxiety and fear. People say, oh, I'm so worried about nuclear war. I'm so worried about COVID-19. I'm so worried about tyranny and apocalypse, right? The instant reaction, and I do this too, my instant instinct is to say, oh, well, that probably won't happen. That probably won't happen. That'll be fine. And it's true that, most disasters you're afraid of probably won't occur. But the reason that doesn't work as a solution to anxiety is because some disasters do occur, right? And so the right way to get sustained joy and sustained courage out of your Christian faith and out of your belief in chivalry is to say, okay, that might happen, right? The worst may occur. And taking a hard, flinty look at that possibility, whatever it is, whatever the thing is in your head that you're most worried about right now, like what is this outcome that you are most afraid of over which you have no control? Is it, an economic disaster? Is it not being able to feed your kids? Is it having war break out on American soil? Like, what is the thing that you are most afraid of? And then take a moment and acknowledge to yourself that may occur. Not saying you shouldn't take every effort to present it, not saying it won't be awful and a tragedy if it does happen, not saying you shouldn't confess that makes you afraid and sad to think of, right? All of these things are part of knighthood too. It's not about bottling up your emotions, these stupid critiques that people make of chivalry, that it's all about stoicism and putting your emotions away. It's not about that at all. It's recognizing that even though your emotions are real and correspond to something true, there is a higher truth to which you are committed. And in the last analysis, no matter what you lose, no loss could be greater than what you gain by standing for honor and in courageous defense of what you believe in, right? This is what chivalry is. It's not sweeping your fear away or under the rug. It's acknowledging your fear, staring it in the face, and saying that though you are scared to death, you will saddle up anyway. Now, in this case, right, things went well, right? Marshal won the Battle of Lincoln, turned the tide. There was a huge kind of rout of the French and their allies at Lincoln. They took the fort, took the town. And that's awesome, and we celebrate that victory, but it's not why we celebrate William Marshal, because that's the point of John of Early's speech, right? We celebrate William Marshal for his acceptance of the risks, right? For even if things went wrong, he still went in. He acknowledged fully and with a full heart, right, that this might not be his day. In fact, might be his last day on earth. And because he believed in the English crown as a thing that was above and beyond any boy king or failed emperor or whatever, he believed in the English crown so much that he would go for that and win the honor and the glory, even if he lost everything else, right? I know that we are in a bleak period for confidence in America as an entity, right? But as an ongoing reality, right? As an idea, as a principle, as a people who will carry those things forward, right? America is our best hope. And so here we are, right? Like having to think about what the best interests are for America and for us as Americans within this moment, within our own sphere of control. That's the framework for asking this question. Accept your fears, acknowledge that they exist, have friends around you to whom you can confess them and who will tell you that although the worst may come, your job is the same, and that is to love God and honor him and seek his salvation above all else. All right. That concludes the portion of this series that will be directly looking at William Marshal and talking about who he was and how his life can teach us to carry the principles of chivalry forward into the modern day. We're going to spend some time now talking about this bigger idea of chivalry as a system, right? Ideals and what ideals do. Because people always, every time you have high ideals or anybody puts high ideals forward, they'll point to hypocrisy, right? Oh, well, it wasn't really like that. The knights weren't really that great. They really, were actually kind of mean and obsessed with plunder. And, it was all high rhetoric to disguise their base humanity. What I've been arguing here, and what I want to stress for us now too, is that is supremely beside the point. Adopting an aspiration to chivalry, right? You don't have to wait for your own self to be admirable and good, and you don't have to wait for the world to have circumstances in it that sort of make it possible to be a glorious knight. We're not going to be fighting on horseback anymore. That world is gone. It's true, right? But the point of chivalry, and this biography makes this point several times, right, is that chivalry is not a description of the world. It's a vision of the world that people live into with their flaws, right? And by living into it and by looking at the life of people before them who lived into those ideals, right, they actually change the circumstances on the ground. We talked about this with Henry the Young King, that the biographer says he became the doorway, the gateway for chivalry to come back into the world. Why? Because he had people that around him, right, that aspired to those ideals and that encouraged him to aspire to those ideals. And that had a knock-on effect, not because Henry the Young King was some especially good person or because the circumstances in England were so conducive to masculine virtue, but rather because masculine virtue was the ideal that people used to shape men like Henry and nations, countries like England, right? So let's think more about how this chivalric ideal, this set of ideals, works, and then let's talk about our own present set of ideals and this notion that we've been thinking about of social constructs and hypocrisy. Let's get into that in a second. Inflation is out of control, but American Hartford Gold is here to help. You have almost certainly noticed that thanks to the policies of this administration, which is spending money as if there were no tomorrow, like it has some big dollar-shaped fire hose, it's just pouring money, which means that it's reducing the value of your paycheck. And when inflation goes up, your savings go down. This is only likely to get worse with everything that's going on in the world, right? So the way to protect your hard-earned wealth against inflation is to call the people at American Hartford Gold. They make it easy to diversify a portion of your portfolio and your retirement accounts against inflation with physical gold and silver. If you call them right now, they will give you up to $1,500 of free silver on your first order. That's $1,500 worth of free silver when you text Heretics, Heretics, to 65532. One more time, you text the word Heretics, Heretics, to 65532, and you will get $1,500 worth of free silver on your first order. They make it easy to protect your assets against inflation. Now is a great time to call them. I've been reading from the Book of the Order of Chivalry. It's one of the most famous and influential contemporary outlines of what it means to be a knight, what it means to be chivalric. And I'm going to read another portion now from chapter 8, the virtues and good habits of a knight. And this is a long chapter. I'm not going to read all of it, but here's just a portion to give you a flavor, right? A knight without faith may not possess good habits of life. For by faith a man sees God and his works spiritually and believes in the invisible things. By faith a man is enabled to have hope, charity, and loyalty, and becomes a servant of honesty and truth. Knights whose habits are shaped by faith often go into the land beyond the sea on pilgrimage, and there prove their strength and chivalry against the enemies of the cross, and become martyrs if they die. The land beyond the sea, that's Outremer, which is the name that Crusaders gave to the Holy Land. So they go to the land beyond the sea, they become martyrs if they die, for they fight to uphold the Holy Catholic faith. Also, on account of faith, clerics of the church are defended by knights from wicked men who, through fraud, rob and disinherit them insofar as possible. Hope is a virtue that plays a very important part in the job of a knight. By the hope that he places in God, he believes that he will emerge victorious in combat. By reason of the faith that he has in God, a greater faith than trust in his body or armor, he overcomes his enemies. I'm going to read that again. By reason of the faith that he has in God, a greater faith than trust in his body or armor, he overcomes his enemies. The courage of a knight is given its power by hope, and through that same virtue conquers laziness and cowardice. Hope urges knights on to endure tribulations and to risk themselves in perilous undertakings in which they often place themselves. Also, hope makes them willing to suffer hunger and thirst while guarding castles, cities and fortresses. If no hope were left, a knight would be powerless to do his job. Hope is the principal instrument of a knight's occupation in the same way that the hand of a carpenter is the chief tool of carpentry. I know you're scared. I'm scared too. Everybody's a little scared right now. We've been scared for a while, I think, right? And it pays to acknowledge that. And the enemies of chivalry, of whom there are many, and who are also enemies of you, be you male or female, right? Because women need chivalry, need men to exhibit chivalry in the world too, right? The enemies of chivalry will point to your fear, just as Satan will point to your fear. And they will say, look, you're afraid. That means that there's no hope for chivalry. There's no nobility or valor in this world. This is just modernity. This is, going gently into that good night, just quietly, cursing God and dying. That was never the point, right? The whole ideal of hope is to put your faith in something greater than your armor, right? A greater trust than in your body or armor, and to overcome all that you may suffer. There's not an if and or but in there, just as there is no if and or but in God's promise that he has overcome the world, right? It does not mean overcome the world. Oh, but things actually look really kind of bad in Ukraine right now. I guess that, never mind. Like, that was too much. Overcome the world, full stop, right? And so if you are a servant of that God, then you know that your fear is not the last word about you, right? And so all of this talk about hypocrisy or chivalry being dead or chivalry being outmoded and outdated, right? It's supremely beside the point. We adopt ideals so that we can live into them and reshape ourselves and the world according to their image, or rather they reshape us. And here's the thing that I want to impress upon you. There is no escaping that. I talked a little bit about this when we talked about All the World's a Stage in Shakespeare, right? That there is no escaping having some model, some vision of life and the good life that you plot your life according to. And so you might as well adopt one that is high and good and aspires to honor God and honor virtue, whatever your circumstances, right? You might as well adopt one like chivalry as any other. And so the people that tell you that because you're scared, because you're a hypocrite, because you're broken and small, you can't aspire to great things, you can't have courage because the world is just too broken and ugly, right? Those people are not your friends, and they're always offering some other vision of life to reshape you, besides the one that you have chosen, right? They're trying to sweep away chivalry so that they can put their own vision of life in front of you and reshape you according to their will. They're not really going to make you, quote unquote, authentic by getting rid of these, quote unquote, social constructs, right? We always aspire to things. We always have a vision of life. We always have values. They might as well be good values. So some of this scholarship on William Marshal actually talks about this a little bit, that William Marshall's example is an example of a real human life in real history that lives out the ideals that had come from literature, right? And from the church teaching on chivalry and from the state teaching on chivalry, right? And this set of ideals, which had really come to its height during Marshal's life, shaped the way that he lived. And then in turn, the way that he lived shaped and perpetuated the idea of chivalry. This is the way that these things work, right? So let me read to you from a couple portions. The first actually is from Dan Jones, whom I haven't mentioned, I don't think, on this podcast. I think you guys would actually really like him. He has this book called Powers and Thrones, just sort of a long history, big doorstopper history of the whole Middle Ages. He seems, from what I can tell, to be kind of a man of the left, but a sensible one, and his history is really good. So I would recommend it to you. And he has a portion on William Marshal, which I wanted to share with you, because it's about this idea that chivalry shapes the man and then the man perpetuates chivalry. Jones writes, William Marshal's example matters. He lived through the zenith of medieval knighthood, when the potency of heavy Frankish cavalry on the battlefield was at its peak, and when the values of chivalry were highly developed in both the literary and political worlds. The biography that his son William and friend John of Early commissioned to commemorate his extraordinary life is one of the greatest documents extant from all of Western medieval history, for it represents the perfect fusion of chivalric literature with political reportage. Frequently, of course, it is self-serving propaganda masquerading as lyric history. We seldom see William behaving badly, moaning about his bad luck, or having an off day on the tournament field. But the account is no worse for its hagiographical tendencies, its tendencies to praise, to overpraise, right? For it shows us better than any other work how the idealized knight's life could play out in practice. Although we cannot always take its assertions and its slant on events as objective truth, Marshal's biography is unbeatable as an applied demonstration of just how deeply the culture of chivalry informed and underpinned political events. It crystallizes what it meant to be a knight, and it shows how one man whose shoulders were broad enough to bear the burden of an exacting moral code could materially shape his times. just as anyone interested in the events and spirit of the years 1939 to 45 must at some point turn to Winston Churchill's self-serving but majestic The Second World War, so too must all people with even a passing interest in the early Plantagenet dynasty, the wars of Henry II, Richard I, and John with the kings of France, and the mindset of chivalric Europe, at some point read the history of William Marshal. I think that's a really great passage because it gets at the mutual formation, right? That the man whose shoulders were broad enough, he says, to carry a moral code, could live out the vision of literature and political theory, right? And then give support and credence to this really civilization-sustaining ideal. And that reference to Churchill in World War II is well chosen also because it suggests, right, that these ideals, although they don't always take the same form and historical shape, right, have inspired generations of men to live them out, right? And so once you establish that ideal and that template in place, right, then it is a guide and it leads new generations of young men who don't know how to shape their raw materials, right? It leads them in the same direction, the same eternal direction of courage, loyalty, and truth, right? In defense, by the way, of William Marshal's biographer and of the sort of veracity of the text, I'd also want to read another guy. This is Nigel Bryant, who translates the version that I've been reading to you. And he kind of takes it up with Jones, not with this book specifically, but he takes up with Jones this idea that this is kind of self-serving, and that we can't be sure of the truth, right? He says, while most readers will hopefully agree that it is indeed dramatic, enjoyable, and interesting, I would suggest that the exaggerations and distortions have themselves been exaggerated. The work does at times treat Marshal and his deeds as heroic in the manner and on the scale of the Chanson de Geste or the Romance of Alexander. But of course it does. Not only were such works the obvious model, the vocabulary, the idiom for recounting the deeds of a great achiever, they were also, in all probability, the model to which Marshal was aspiring in his life, and successfully, to the point where he could become such a model himself. For achieve greatly he undeniably did. He was, by any standards, extraordinary and seen as such by his contemporaries, and we should beware of responding with too much 21st century cynicism or skepticism and of looking too eagerly for flaws in him and deliberate omissions or evasions in his work. The values and expectations of his time were not our own. I would also argue that his biography is self-serving only insofar as it was designed not simply to commemorate a life, which was outstandingly worthy of record and celebration, but also to refute contemporary allegations against Marshal that his family and the author felt were unjustified and in need of rebuttal. Listen to this again, right? The model to which Marshal was aspiring in his life, right? The Chanson de Geste and the Romance of Alexander were the model to which Marshal was aspiring in his life and which he upheld by his actions, right? This is the idea, the reciprocal nature of the fact that, yeah, of course, some of this stuff comes from literature and poetry. Where else do we get our ideals, right? Literature and poetry are part of how we shape ourselves and how we shape future generations. And, as for the accuracy of the exaggerations or not, I'm going to leave you to sort that out on your own, right? There are a million different places where you could argue with him. I mean, I think Jones is probably right that there's some over the top phrasing in this biography, but part of what I'm saying is that, like, it's the point, right? The Chansons de Geste, which are those, grand poems of great deeds and sort of semi-mythical, semi-legendary stories like the Song of Roland, right? They exist, right, precisely to form our ideals. And one of the things that I'm stressing here today is that you're going to have those around you, right? The poetry, the art, the government propaganda that surrounds you, right, is going to shape your ideals. And so you might as well be aware of that and pick good ideals. And to prove this point, let me bring out in a couple unexpected sources to show that there are always ideals, sometimes from the government, sometimes from Hollywood and the media and from arts, right? There are always ideals that shape you. And so you ought to know which ones you choose. Let me read to you from an unexpected source now to make this point. I have two unexpected sources that I want to draw on to make this point that we are always living by some set of values. First is Joan Didion. Didion died recently. She was a very beloved essayist and writer, chronicler, and among other things, of the 70s and the hippie movement and the kind of atomization that led hippies to, little young kids to leave their homes and become hippies and do drugs and whatever. Very sharp, perceptive writer, a really kind of admired writer for a lot of, women, especially women, female essayists. Let me read to you a passage now from an essay she did about Lucille Miller, who was a woman accused of murdering her husband after a failed romance with another man, a kind of adulterous fling. This is an essay called Some Dreamers of the Golden Dream. And it's about this breakup between Miller and her lover, her adulterous lover. Didion writes, "It was in the breakup that the affair ceased to be in the conventional mode and began to resemble instead the novels of James M. Cain, the movies of the late 1930s, all the dreams in which violence and threats and blackmail are made to seem commonplaces of middle-class life. What was most startling about the case that the state of California was preparing against Lucille Miller was something that had nothing to do with law at all, something that never appeared in the 8-column afternoon headlines, but was always there between them, the revelation that the dream was teaching the dreamers how to live. Here is Lucille Miller talking to her lover sometime in the early summer of 1964 after he had indicated that on the advice of his minister, he did not intend to see her anymore. First, I'm going to go to that dear pastor of yours and tell him a few things. When I do tell him that, you won't be in the Redlands church anymore. Look, sonny boy, if you think your reputation is going to be ruined, your life won't be worth 2 cents. She goes on with some other quotes from this rather sordid affair. But the important line here, the dream was teaching the dreamers how to live. Didion is observing that these are people whose vision of life and the good life and indeed the bad life and everything in between is shaped by this template of 1930s sort of noir, hard-boiled detective fiction. And they're basically acting as if they're living within these movies and these books because those are the ideals with which their life has been saturated. And if you think that you are exempt from this, in the digital age, when you're constantly being bombarded by all sorts of information and templates and ideas and images, right, and moving pictures and Netflix and streaming stuff, right, then you're crazy. You are not exempt from this, right? We too are being shaped. These templates make an impression upon us, and then they shape how we live. And that's what I've been suggesting chivalry is. It's one of the templates, right? So if this is going to be happening to you, you might as well pick a template that's going to shape you toward the highest ideals, right? I would suggest that medieval chivalry, despite the fact that the world has changed, right? Medieval chivalry is a saner and more beautiful and enduring set of ideals, template for shaping manhood than 1930s detective noir, or indeed than whatever we've got going on today. Because my second source that I want to bring to you is the life of Julia. Some people may remember this. This is from 2012. And it was a kind of an infographic cartoon that the Obama campaign put out in 2012 in order to sort of attack Mitt Romney and prop up government spending. And Julia was this sort of cartoon in that style that we're all now familiar with, where like they don't have any faces and there's sort of blocky colors. It's really ugly internet style, right? This was a 2012 cartoon in that style, all about how Julia's life was being taken care of by the government. Here's a panel that made a particular splash, right? Under President Obama, Julia decides to have a child. Throughout her pregnancy, she benefits from maternal checkups, prenatal care, and free screenings under healthcare reform. Under Mitt Romney, healthcare reform would be repealed. So Julia decides to have a child. That was the big line here, right? Because where's the man in her life, right? This is this sort of atomized, detached person. The government, this sort of force that looms over her whole life, this disembodied force, shapes everything, gives her everything, teaches her how to live, right? This received a huge backlash, but I don't think quite recognized that that's what this is. This is an attempt, right, to offer a new template, to shape the ideals of human life in a new direction, away from chivalry, away even from the kind of 1930s noir that Didion was writing about, right, toward parentalism, toward government control, toward, just this kind of atomized life where everything is fine and we're placid and we just get taken care of, right? There is no escaping this. The world offers templates to you that shape you. And this Life of Julia is another example of an attempt to do this. People might ask these days, I think, and people have asked me, right? The world is going crazy. Everything is falling apart. Modernity has just taken this like crazy trip into dystopia and insanity. What are you doing running a podcast about like medieval knights that nobody's ever heard of? What are you doing, like defending the West when it's so obviously crumbling and died, with the Soviet Union, fell with the Soviet Union? What are you doing, right? It's because of this. It's because you are going to have visions of what life ought to be presented to you, and they are going to shape you. And I want at least one of those visions to be the chivalric vision of William Marshal, because if it's just a tiny antidote to the life of Julia or whatever crap the government is pushing on you to try to turn you into their own pawn, right? I want you to have another model. That's why we read the books of the past, because it breaks us out of the pervasive models, the pervasive templates that everybody who wants to control us is trying to use to shape us, and shows us another way. Chivalry is another way. In just a second, I'm going to take a mailbag question from locals about how exactly we can live this kind of thing out in our lives today. But this is the point, right? The point is that you have templates in your life, you have ideals and aspirations, and you're being taught to aspire to them by the same people that tell you that your high and noble ideas, your concept that you could ever live out chivalry, that's outdated and it's not possible, and there's no such thing as shaping human nature in that direction. Well, these are people that want to shape your human nature into their direction, right? They are not your friends. William Marshal is, classical education is, and the great texts of the West are here for you still. I have had the hardest time finding good tea in America until I found Gold River Trading Company. I'm so glad that they're sponsoring the show because I'm a big tea fan. I think people can kind of get down on tea in the States because we think of it, the Boston Tea Party, as we raise our noses at this sort of fruity English drink or whatever. But it's not like that at all. I mean, the founders drank tea. Lots of folks throughout our history have drank tea. This is a kind of pro-American frontier-based company. It's about striking forth into the new world and new endeavors. And that's the theme of all their tea. They've got a 1776 American breakfast black tea, which I love. And I'm also a big fan of their gunpowder green tea. But they have a bunch of different varieties. You can try it out. Even if you've never been a tea drinker before, I suggest you refine your tastes, my good man, and check out the Gold River Trading Company. goldriverco.com is their website. And when you use the offer code Heretics, you will get 10% off. That's goldriverco.com. Use the promo code Heretics and you'll get 10% off. Truly, these guys have become my new favorite tea company. You will love the stuff they make. goldriverco.com. Use the offer code Heretics and get 10% off. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals. If ever there were a topic for which it pays to be on Locals, Chivalry is it. Locals is the place where, out of the reach of big tech, out of the censorship, beyond the reach of all the little gremlins that want to turn you into Julia, right? We gather together, VIPs gather together to talk about how we're going to live our lives according to the principles of the West, no matter what goes wrong, right? No matter what's happening in the world. And so the question today is about that in some ways, but more generally, right, the Locals VIP community is the place to go to talk with me more about this. And there's exclusive access to all sorts of other stuff like essays that I write, and you get episodes a week in advance without ads, all sorts of good stuff that I really hope you will join us for, because it's worthwhile and now's the time for it. So go to youngheretics.com/locals to become a VIP. We are running an exclusive 1-month free trial keyed directly to this episode. And the promo code is Marshal, 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 in honor of William Marshal, whom we've been talking about for the last 2 weeks. Here's a mailbag question from Falderall. It seems that most of the earliest and arguably best church fathers and saints were all martyred, from the martyrdom of Stephen until the First Crusade 1,000 years later, possibly leading to the expression, good men die young. So what are the parameters for chivalry? Though many early Christians were soldiers, it doesn't seem that chivalry started until the end of the Viking Age and the Norman invasion of England, possibly due to natural selection. From my perspective, it seems like all the good peacekeepers had to die before those that remained became knights. Further, it seems that chivalry had mostly died with the advent of the modern age, when honor and virtue seemed to be distilled down to equality, tolerance, and kindness. What are the conditions for chivalry to survive, grow, and thrive? So Falderall is asking exactly this question, right? What is the world now? A world where it is possible to be chivalric, right? To be chivalrous, and to live out the ideals that I've been talking about with William Marshal and all those other guys. Because, of course, the concept of chivalry only comes up in the medieval period, as Falderall is pointing out. And there's self-sacrifice in other periods, there's loyalty in other periods, there's integrity. All of these are ideals, right? But the idea that chivalry is a particular thing that a mounted knight needs to exhibit is a unique thing in the world, right? Here's what I would say. The values of chivalry are not unique to the Middle Ages, right? loyalty, honor, virtue, manly virtue, right? All of these things. Like I've been saying, chivalry is a tool, a template, a set of ideas that we use to shape the raw material of manhood toward those eternal virtues, which have been expressed in other ways at other times because of other circumstances, right? So whatever circumstance you're in, if you're living in the Christian church, the persecuted Christian church in the early 4th century AD, right, before the conversion of the Roman Empire, then you're going to display your courage and all of your various virtues. You're going to seek and pursue those virtues in very different ways, perhaps by, going to the lions rather than giving up Christ. And there are all sorts of exemplars of that, right? In the medieval period, right, these manly virtues become necessary in a very specific way that do have to do with the conditions on the ground, right? People are starting to fight on horseback. Warlordism is sort of breaking out across the European continent. Kings need a way to sort of sustain and consolidate their power and to encourage loyalty, besides which we have to find a way to keep the barbarism of men in check, right? To stop them from looting and pillaging and raping everywhere. And so we gradually over time, we developed this system called chivalry. That system, the historically specific system, you might say, is gone forever because we don't fight on horseback anymore, right? There's no such thing anymore as being a medieval knight. And if you try, you'll look silly and foolish. That's what Don Quixote is about, right? It's about somebody trying to live those values out when the time frame for them has gone, right? And the theater on which we might express them has become totally different. That's why Don Quixote is crazy. The values, the principles that chivalry expresses remain intact. And so the history of chivalry after the time of knighthood, right, is generalizing chivalry again. It's like it goes through this funnel, right, and it basically crystallizes into this form that has a specific historical shape. But then the ideal of chivalry comes to mean, right, just embodying those virtues in whatever context you find yourself. And so this is why I said, I don't know what situation you're going to be in when you listen to my words right now, right? I'm trying to give you these principles, and then you can think about ways that you can enact them. So let's say, for example, that your great fear is the economic sanctions causing high prices and inflation, right? Then you have a responsibility, a duty, right, to look with courage at that fear and shore up your finances, find streams of income, right? Look at cryptocurrency, look at investment in gold, right? Figure out things that are going to shore up your finances as best you can, and then commit, right, to nevertheless loving your family and standing by them and, dying for them if needs must, should that collapse and should it become impossible for you. You don't have control over everything, but you do have control over your sphere. And so ask yourself, what is the sphere over which I have control? And what does chivalry look like in that theater, right? On that plane. You're not going to get up on horseback. You're not going to woo a damsel in distress in a high castle, fun as that might be, right? Remember that to those people who were living that out in those times, it did not look like some grand adventure. It looked just like the world looks to us now. Things were going badly. They were afraid. They didn't know if things were going to turn out okay. All they had was their God and their ideals to commit to. And I am suggesting that chivalric teaching is not about like what horse you ride, but about how you look at the sphere of influence around you, which remember is very different from like what's going on in the world, which you do not control. Christ has overcome the world. You have no power over it. It's going to be what it's going to be. And so your question is, what power do you have? You still have a vote in this country, thank God. You still have, sovereignty over your family, and you can take steps to increase that sovereignty, to increase your independence, right? To increase your independence from the U.S. dollar, to increase your independence from, perhaps even the stream of income, income from people who hate you, who are going to fire you for your principles about the vaccine or whatever, right? Like be seeking those and see how you can live out chivalry in that sphere. I agree with you that modern virtues are not enough. Equality, tolerance, kindness, right? These are watered down virtues. They're not useless, but they're not enough. And we're seeing that now. And so the question is not, how are we going to recover the world that existed in William Marshall's day? The question is, what do we draw from William Marshall's experience that we can apply within our own sphere of influence? Hope that helps answer your question, Falderal. We will continue talking more about this on Locals. If you're not yet a VIP, please join us. We'd love to see you there. youngheretics.com/locals. Use the promo code Marshall for a month free on your annual subscription. That's it from me. I will see you next week. As always, if you like the work that we do here, you will also love the Claremont Institute. We are a think tank in defense of the recovery of the American idea, and we put out 2 publications, The American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books. You can find them both online, and the CRB also comes in a dead tree copy that you can get when you subscribe. If you would like to support our work, go to claremont.org/donate and let them know in the notes that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics, because that always helps me with my bosses, makes them feel very good. We were convening for a meeting the other day, and they were very pleased to find that people were hearing about Claremont through Young Heretics. That's great. It's good for the reputation of the show. It's good for Claremont. It's good for everybody. So do mention that. And mention the show to your friends, to your pals. This is, I believe, a really important show. I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't believe that. People I know have connected to it, and I would love to keep that going and to spread the word. So please let your friends know in any medium that you can. Let them know why it's important, like I was talking about in this episode. Tweet about it. Give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. However you can spread the word, I would really appreciate that. All right, folks, that's it from me. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.